a private consulting company. He also serves as a part-time instructor on domestic terrorism at the ATF National Academy. Previously, Mr. Johnson was the Senior Domestic Terrorism Analyst at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, where he led a team of analysts responsible for analyzing domestic extremist activity. Prior to his service at DHS, Mr. Johnson was the lead expert on violent anti-government groups at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He began his federal career as a counterterrorism analyst for the U.S. Army. I'm going to hold off, as I mentioned, until Senator Cole arrives to introduce you formally, Mr. Siney. But thank you for being here. Let me start then with Mr. Johnson, if you would like to testify, and then Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Siney.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to appear before you to discuss the significant issue of domestic terrorism, and in particular the threat from violent extremists. The rising threat of domestic terrorism within the United States should not diminish our focus on deterring threats from al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Rather, our nation's intelligence and law enforcement resources need to be flexible and resilient in their ability to combat terrorism from all sources of violent extremism, including domestic non-Islamic extremists. The threat from domestic terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies is often dismissed and overlooked in the national media and within the U.S. government. Yet we are currently seeing an upsurge in domestic non-Islamic extremist activity, specifically from violent right-wing extremists. While violent left-wing attacks were more prevalent in the 1970s, today the bulk of violent domestic activity emanates from right-wing extremists. Recent acts of domestic terrorism have instilled fear within the U.S. populations as extremists attempt to force their social and political agendas through violence. Since 9/11 terrorist attacks, Muslim extremists within the United States, either aligned with al-Qaeda's ideology or other perverse interpretation of violent jihad, have carried out 5 attacks on U.S. soil. These attacks resulted in 17 deaths, 13 of which was from a single violent act at Fort Hood. There have also been numerous arrests related to alleged Muslim extremist terrorists plotting in the U.S. since 9/11. In contrast, there has also been a multitude of domestic non-Islamic extremist attacks, many of which have resulted in deaths and injuries over the past 4 years. In particular, domestic right-wing extremists trumped all other forms of ideologically motivated violence in the U.S. for a number of deaths during this time period. Some may urge or argue that right-wing extremist attacks in the U.S. are more prevalent than homegrown Muslim extremists because they represent multiple movements such as white supremacists, militia extremists, sovereign citizens, and anti-abortion extremists. This is simply not true. I would argue that homegrown Muslim extremists in the U.S. have an equally, if not more diverse set of extremist causes and radical Islamic movements to choose from, including al-Qaeda and its affiliates, al-Shabaab, Hezbollah, Hamas, just to name a few. Since the 2008 presidential election, domestic non-Islamic extremists have attacked 27 law enforcement officers, killing 16. Over a dozen mosques have been attacked with firebombs, likely attributed to individuals embracing Islamophobic beliefs. In May 2009, an abortion doctor was murdered while attending church. 2 other assassination plots against abortion providers were thwarted during 2011, and 6 women's health care clinics were attacked with explosive and incendiary devices within the past 2 years. Since 2010, there have been multiple plots to kill ethnic minorities, police, and other government officials by militia extremists and white supremacists in our country. In January 2010, we had a tax resistor deliberately crash his small plane filled with a 50-gallon drum of gasoline into an IRS processing center in Austin, Texas, injuring 13 people and killing a government employee. The following year, 3 incendiary bombs were mailed to government officials in Annapolis, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Also, in January 2011, a backpack bomb was placed along a Martin Luther King parade route in Spokane, Washington, meant to kill and injure participants in a civil rights march. In August 2012 alone, a white supremacist killed 6 worshipers at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Sovereign citizens have shot 4 sheriff deputies, killing 2 in St. John's Parish, Louisiana, and 4 active-duty U.S. Army soldiers who had formed an anti-government militia group and were hoarding weapons and ammunition in an alleged plot to overthrow the government were charged in the deaths of 2 associates who they worried might tip law enforcement to their clandestine activities. There was also what appears to have been an incident of left-wing domestic terrorism. A single-issue extremist reportedly shot a guard at the Family Research Council office here in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, these are only the latest manifestations of domestic non-Islamic extremist violence in the homeland. It is also important to note that 8 members of the Hootery, an extremist militia in Michigan that were acquitted this year of plotting to kill police officers and planting bombs at their funerals, had an arsenal of weapons at their disposal that was larger than all 230-plus Muslim plotters and attackers charged in the U.S. since 9/11 combined. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the federal government must do more to combat domestic terrorism within the U.S. Our failure to act now will assuredly embolden the enemy and bring more attacks. At the federal level, there is a shortage of analysts assigned to monitor and assess domestic extremist activity in the U.S. Currently, the FBI is the only federal agency that has devoted multiple full-time resources to research and analyze domestic terrorist tactics, tradecraft, and emerging trends. Today, the DHS has few resources conducting strategic analysis on domestic terrorist threats. More resources are needed. Other federal agencies should also consider devoting analysts full-time to this subject rather than part-time or on an ad hoc basis. While great strides have been made with respect to information sharing since 9/11 terrorist attacks, jurisdictional infighting remains among departments and agencies, as well as communication gaps between levels of government, local, state, and federal. State and local fusion centers have filled this important role in the information sharing gap, but more can be done. Many law enforcement officers and analysts who looked at domestic terrorism issues during the 90s have retired or have moved on to other assignments, which leaves a massive void in knowledge and experience. A whole generation of state and local officers has not been trained and has no clue to what to look for. Some civil rights and civil liberties organizations, particularly within the U.S. government, fail to recognize the role of extremist ideologies play in motivating extremists to carry out acts of violence. As a result, they have severely curtailed monitoring efforts within our nation's law enforcement agencies. Monitoring a person's behavior becomes all the more clear when coupled with an understanding of extremist beliefs. As a result, there needs to be a balanced approach to intelligence analysis and threat assessment comprising both extremist ideology and suspicious behavior. At DHS, the most prevalent hurdle to timely dissemination of domestic terrorism-related information is the Group of 6 G6 review process. The G6 review process, as it currently stands, negatively impacts INA analysis because some of the changes in products seem to be made using standards that are in direct conflict with the intelligence community analytic standards. G6 review can adversely affect an analyst's objectivity and political neutrality. The apparent purpose and intent of the G6 review process is to screen products for objectionable words, phrases, or topics that are politically sensitive or perceived as offensive to certain groups of people. It is important that the U.S. government take the lead in developing new strategies and tools for law enforcement and the courts to better deal with problems associated with domestic extremism. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for allowing me to testify about this most important issue facing our nation. For many years, we have focused on the threat from al-Qaeda and homegrown Muslim extremists. It's now time to also strengthen our resolve to combat violent domestic non-Islamic extremism in all of its forms. For the record, I have offered some of my insights concerning the domestic terrorist threat, our current limitations, and best practices in my written testimony. I hope that some of these points will resonate with committee members and inspire to explore new ways to mitigate this threat and prevent future acts of violence. And I look forward to responding to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson. Our next witness is Harpreet Singh Saini, the son of Paran